Morning.
7's Nicole Ensalada is live in our nation's capital with more on what today's services will look like. Nicole, good morning.
Well, good morning. And you know, all this morning we've seen people show up here, just folks from all different walks of life. Some folks who are tourists, people from Maryland and Virginia, a lot of people who showed up here last night with their families, with their dogs. So interesting to see how this Supreme Court justice impacted their lives.
I think she just stood for kind of justice and doing the right thing and equal rights for everyone.
Since Friday night, the Chappell family has been talking a lot about Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
She was kind of larger than life. She became larger than life over the years.
I didn't really know that women didn't have a credit card that late.
11-year-old Xavier is talking about attorney Ruth Bader Ginsburg's advocacy of a 1974 law that allowed women to obtain credit in their own names, a seemingly small but crucial step in a legacy of legal battles, both won and lost, that stretched over decades. Days after the death of the 87-year-old justice, flowers still line the barricades surrounding the Supreme Court. Cards like this one, which appears to be written by a young girl named Isabel, thanks her for everything she did for girls. Another girl named Annika apparently left this page from a coloring book. And of course, a little lace collar.
How old are you?
13.
13? Is it hard for you to imagine a time when women had to think about this kind of stuff, like being equal?
It's hard for me to imagine because there's still a lot of work to be done.
I think the thing I want them to understand is how important it is to do your job well. So more than just the politics of the whole thing, it's someone who dedicated their service to our country and actually did a very, very good job.
And one more lesson.
You're tough on your own.
Yeah.
And here is what we can expect today. The body of Ruth Bader Ginsburg will lie in repose at the Great Hall in the U.S. Supreme Court. That is today, in just a little while, and tomorrow as well, until 10 o'clock in the evening. And then Friday, she will lie in state at the U.S. Capitol. Now, she is the first woman to lie in state at the U.S. Capitol because she is a government or military official. That's when one of those two categories, you're lying in state at the U.S. Capitol. Rosa Parks also had the same honor, but it's considered lying in honor because she was a civilian. And then on Tuesday, a private interment at Arlington National Cemetery. Well, she will be laid to rest next to her husband, Martin Ginsburg. Now, we are expecting that the casket will arrive here sometime within the next, most likely in the next 20 to 30 minutes or so. We understand that Capitol Police will be the actual pallbearers, but honorary pallbearers will be the law clerks who worked with her and served with her in the United States Supreme Court. And then that private ceremony, we understand, will take place, will last about 30 minutes or so, and then that is when the public will be able to come here, pay their respects. We ran into a lot of people last night who said they planned to spend the night, including one gentleman who is tying a rainbow flag, the flag of the LGBTQ community, onto one of these barricades you see behind me. So emotional, said he wanted to be here as well. Reporting live in Washington, D.C., Nicole Ensalada for Today in Florida.
And live pictures right now as the country remembers Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She will lie in repose at the U.S. Supreme Court, as you see a powerful showing there, her casket arriving there in front of the court shortly. A private ceremony will take place in the Great Hall very shortly, attended by her family, close friends, and members of the court who you saw there on the steps.
More than 100 of her former clerks will meet the casket and accompany it up the stone steps leading to the Great Hall. Remembered as a champion for women's rights, it's important to remember that she had her own fight. Attending Harvard in the 1950s, one of the things that she's remembered for is talking about how a dean asked her, well, why do you think you should come to Harvard when you're taking a man's spot? So she fought that her entire life, and look at the huge success she had, dying at the age of 87 after a long battle with pancreatic cancer, which had first been diagnosed in 2009 and then sadly recurred and ultimately claimed her life. 7's Nicole Ensalada is live there. And Nicole, you've been telling us that since last night, you have seen such an outpouring of emotional support And I was really touched by the father who you spoke to, who said, you know what, I brought my son here so that he could see what it's like to live right, to serve our country, and basically, that's just so touching, you know, that he wants to pass on that legacy.
Absolutely, and you know, that wasn't just the only family out here. There were lots of families with their little kids, a lot of little girls, and that particular family had 2 sons, very well spoken. The mom also said that they have been talking about Ruth Bader Ginsburg now since Friday, really, and they have a little daughter as well, and trying to encourage her and learn lessons from her life. And you know, you mentioned that anecdote about Harvard. She was one of 9 women in a class of roughly 500, and that Harvard dean said to all of them, you know, you're taking the place of a man. So difficult. It's so hard for us, I think, in this day and age to imagine what that must be like to have someone actually say something like that to you. And maybe perhaps for some people it's not so hard to believe. But she eventually left Harvard and went to Columbia. And as I'm speaking here, I know you're watching what's going on behind me here. We've got they're waiting for the motorcade. I believe I may have seen it as it was rounding the corner, just a short distance from here. And that's when all the law clerks came out. The Capitol Police, we understand, will be taking the casket up into the Great Hall, but these clerks will all be the pallbearers. You know, she was turned down for a Supreme Court clerkship when she graduated from Columbia Law School. She went to Cornell, then Harvard, then graduated from Columbia, and she was turned down for a clerkship in Felix Frankfurter's office. Gender, apparently, it is now thought, was behind all of that. Very difficult for her to get a job. She ended up going into academia, then working with the ACLU, co-founding a women's equality project, and that is when she started really building her career as a litigator as opposed to being a professor and working in the academic world. Just building on case by case, and you know, a lot of her cases in the beginning had to do with discrimination against men. She thought that that might be a smarter way to try to approach equality cases. She, as was depicted in the movie about her life, she did represent a man who was trying to get a tax credit as a caregiver, taking care of his mom. But she also represented a man who was a widower, whose wife died in childbirth, and she was the primary caregiver, or rather income earner, because she was a teacher. And this man was unable to get her Social Security benefits because as a man, as a widower, it was thought that he didn't need them. So she argued successfully for this man to be able to get Social Security benefits. So building on case by case and actually arguing before the Supreme Court many, many times before she was actually named a justice back in 1993 by Bill Clinton. And of course, we know her also for her famous I dissent, because many of the cases that she dissented on so famously were some of the reasons why she became so well known and set herself apart from many of the other justices. So once again, we are watching these clerks as they await the casket. There are so many people out here in the front plaza. The folks who would like to then pay their respects by walking past the casket, we understand, are lining up around the corner. We cannot see that line from where we are, but we spoke to so many people yesterday who said that they planned to spend the night. Some of those folks that we ran into, one of them I mentioned earlier, brought a rainbow flag out here because her decision, her role in the decision involving same-sex marriage back in 2015, so emotional for some of the gentlemen that we ran into out here. Now you can see some of the clerks are starting to approach the roadway. It is absolutely silent out here. So I will be quiet just for a moment so you can get a sense of what it's actually like out here on the plaza. And I'm starting to see the first cars, I think, pull up. Christine, Diana.
And Nicole, as we watched these live pictures and got that sense there of the solemn nature of this event, as so many across America watch in person and across the country on television, as you see the body of the woman who embodied so much of what America is today as a result of her own sacrifice and experiences. And as we watch this unfold right now, you're starting to hear the reaction as the motorcade makes its way there to the front steps. Now, following the ceremony here, Ginsburg will lie in repose at the portico there at the top steps of the Supreme Court building and allow for those public viewings to begin. All those folks, so many who traveled from all across the country to pay their respects.
You know, and we think, of course, of the highest court in the land as all about equality and fairness, and that's what, of course, the court should strive for. But then when you think about her, and she personifies that, one of her famous quotes, "Women will only have true equality when men share with them the responsibility of bringing up the next generation." We talk about the many struggles that she lived through to get to her position and how she championed the cause for so many after her. You know, some funny anecdotes about her life. So because of as well known as she was, as you mentioned, Nicole, they started calling her the notorious RBG. And she heard that several times. And at one point she asked a clerk, "Hey, why are they calling me that? What does that mean?" And the clerk laughed and told her, "Well, it's actually a reference to the late rapper Notorious B.I.G." And so it became a huge deal, and she would often talk about that. So, you know, she just became so well liked and so personable and so relatable, which is often not the case with someone in such a high position. Nicole?
Well, and it's true. And, you know, it's also interesting that because of her public persona, you learn so much more about how the court really does affect daily lives. As you mentioned, the family from last night, the little boy mentioned the fact that she was involved with that credit case. That was back in the 1970s. Women could not get a credit card without having either the approval or the name of their husband on the credit card. And she was involved and pushed for a case that changed that. It's just these little parts of life that the court can touch, and of course same-sex marriage, the Lilly Ledbetter Equal Pay Act, which resulted from a case that was actually lost here at the Supreme Court, but she dissented and said, "Hey, Congress, it's now in your court." So it's all these things that we may not think of in our day-to-day lives that are touched by this high court. And then she had this public persona, which apparently she really relished in, including the Saturday Night Live depiction, which I think all tied together to really make her so relatable as someone who has been involved in all of these fights, maybe not in the public eye so much until she became a Supreme Court justice. And now we see the casket. It is absolutely quiet out here. A lot of phones, people with their phones up. That casket will lie on the catafalque that was used for Abraham Lincoln back in 1865. So a lot of history we're watching right here.
And as we continue to look at these live pictures, it's so poignant to have more than 100 of her former clerks there meeting the casket as family members are there lined up as well. Going up the stone steps, so historic, such an integral part of our history, leading up to the Great Hall, where this liberal icon presided for almost 30 years and where she made the most impact on others. And the Supreme Court will honor Ginsburg in this private ceremony here. Then, so important, also the public viewing. Her former clerks, by the way, will stand guard. They will not leave the casket as this continues to unfold. And when you know the history behind this iconic woman who in her later years, as Christine mentioned, became a celebrity for those younger generations as she continued on in her work and her presence, fighting back against illness and not missing work, which was so remarkable that she fought through personal struggles that even in the last years and months of her life, she made it an obligation of hers to fulfill everyone's expectations and her role in the court.
And, you know, just to interject, she really loved what she did. And she had said, and her family has said, it never really crossed her mind to ever step down, and felt like it had to be really on her timetable. This is a lifetime appointment. And she has been fighting cancer since 1999. Her mother died of cancer. Her husband died of cancer, and she herself has been fighting that, which is so hard to believe, since 1999, various forms of cancer. So I think a lot of folks thought she might be indestructible. But of course, Friday we learned that, of course, she is not. She will be lying in the great hall of the Supreme Court. Only two others, Thurgood Marshall and Earl Warren, have had that honor. And then, of course, as you mentioned, on Friday, she will lie in state at the United States Capitol. Many others, Rosa Parks being the only other woman, have been able to lie in state in the Capitol, or rather to lie in honor in the Capitol, because Rosa Parks was a civilian, but she will be lying in state because Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a government official. So she has been given that honor, the first woman to be given that honor.
You know, we've talked about her work ethic and how strong it was and how she loved what she did. Well, the day after her husband died, she was back at work. So if that doesn't show you not only her own personal health battles, but even emotionally when she was struggling, she was still there for our country. I mean, and that's the kind of service that people admire in her. They see in her this amazing person who really did put our country's needs before her own, even as she fought her own personal difficult battles. Now, we should mention, you know, we've talked about the private ceremony, we've talked about the public viewing and lying in repose. We should also mention that because of the Jewish high holidays, Ginsburg will be buried next Tuesday. So that's September 29th, after Yom Kippur, which is the most solemn day in the Jewish calendar. She's going to be laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery next to her husband of 56 years, Marty, who died in 2010.
And you always said that Marty Ginsburg really was her biggest cheerleader, and then together they raised their children. You know, when she was in law school, that's when she had her daughter, Jane, and then subsequently had a son as well. But she was a mom when she was going through law school and working and becoming a litigator and a professor. So this is somebody who really started life very early on as a wife and a mother, and always said that Marty Ginsburg was really her biggest cheerleader, that they truly were a family of equals. You were also talking about her work ethic. She also took the somewhat unusual step in many of her dissents of reading her dissents aloud, which really seemed to give them more impact, rather than just submitting them to the court when she would be on the losing side, the 5-4 side, the 4 side of the 5-4. She would sometimes read those dissents aloud, and that's when she became known for her I dissent, which in some ways are many of the opinions she's most remembered for, especially when it comes to, say, the Voting Rights Act a few years ago, when parts of that act were gutted. She made sure that that dissent became well known.
And Nicole, as we look at these live pictures and these solemn moments and a final goodbye here to such an amazing woman who left such a lasting legacy on our country and on her profession, you see those who she impacted personally there, not just her family, friends, but the clerks who met the casket there and will be standing guard throughout this ceremony. It really is unbelievable, the impact that we don't even see in these pictures and in some of these anecdotes. Those women who have gone through the law system, as you noted earlier, her impact felt all across not just the country, but in her profession as well, with the battles that she personally had to overcome. And as an example, living example, even to the end, very well aware of what was going on in politics and in so many of our struggles that our nation is currently having. Her death, of course, coming less than 50 days before the presidential election, and it, of course, has become an issue of her replacement on the court, a controversial one, but she herself had some strong opinions of it.
She definitely did, and she did get into some hot water with some of the comments that she made indirectly about President Trump that she apologized for. Right now you can see that some of the family members, I believe, are lining up before the casket. Members of the Supreme Court and their spouses. I believe we're seeing Justice Thomas and his wife Ginny off to the left. I believe I did see Brett Kavanaugh in the back there with his wife. She does leave behind a daughter and a son. I believe, 4 grandchildren. Her daughter followed her footsteps into the world of law, and she is also a professor, I believe, at Columbia University as well. And you can see folks all with their masks, socially distant except for members of the family, members of the court there inside the Great Hall. Even despite the pandemic, they're able to give her this honor, just still, trying to be as safe as they possibly can, which we are all finding ourselves in this situation, trying to navigate this. The Supreme Court, obviously, doing the same thing that we're all doing as far as that goes, trying to make sure they can give her this honor safely.
Nicole, as we're talking to you and as we're looking at these live pictures and we look at a room filled with people who knew her best and probably have a lot of stories to share about things they did together, things they talked about, I can't help but think about the card you showed us earlier that looked like it had been written by a little girl and left there for her. And thinking, the many people who didn't know her personally who will live to be inspired by her. I mean, isn't that what this country is all about, having heroes like that? And looking at this in a year, 2020, which we can't argue has been one of the most tumultuous years our country has ever seen. How beautiful to see this. Let's go ahead and listen in. It's brilliant. 7's Nicole Ensalada continues our coverage. Very, very touching words. So beautiful to watch, Nicole.
It was, and when you were talking about the little girls, and we had mentioned a bit earlier the families that we saw out here last night, as I mentioned, there were a lot of families, but ever since the news broke on Friday that she had passed away, we know that there were crowds of people who just showed up here at the Supreme Court just on their own, no barricades set up, nothing like that, nothing had been planned, showed up and started leaving flowers, and there was just a sea of flowers out here. The Capitol Police, the Park Police have been picking up all of those flowers and all of the other mementos. We're told many of them will go to the family. Others will go to any museums that request them, that sort of thing. But that was one common denominator we kept seeing, were notes from little girls, like one we mentioned last night and this morning, the page from a coloring book from a little girl, and other notes. And a lot of young women were out here last night, maybe high school, college age, doing the same thing, looking very somber and looking like they truly were here to pay respects, not just to see what was going on, but to, that they were really impacted by this. And there was one young lady that I saw who was here with another little girl. They left some stones out there, as is, the Jewish tradition, just to show that, they were here paying their respects to the person who had passed away. And she was also wearing a lace collar. She, just with regular street clothes, wearing her lace collar just to show how much she cares about Ruth Bader Ginsburg and how much that she had really impacted her life. And when you were talking about not being seen, it wasn't also just women. We had mentioned earlier the cases that she took on that involved discrimination against men, but she also was involved in many same-sex cases, as well as also a mental health case that took place several years ago when she was on the bench, where she wrote the decision that allowed for the mentally ill or those who suffer from mental illnesses to fall under the Americans with Disabilities Act, where they had not before. And it was a case, I believe it was out of Georgia, where there were some women who were going to be institutionalized, but they wanted to be in a community setting, and they said that under the Americans with Disabilities Act, they should have that choice. And that court, the opinion written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, said, yes, you do fall under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So it does seem to be a common thread that has run through her career, taking those who may have been unseen before and making them seen. And the fact that they too fall under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution, that they do count as well. Christine, Diana.
And so many of those